Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Mahendra Samaravikrama, Manager of Data Science and Analytics in the Australian Red Cross. Today in the IFRC Penetrate Summit 2021, we will demonstrate our project on enabling equity and inclusion for First Nations peoples on emerging technology through citizen science to mitigate their risk related to climate change. First of all, in the spirit of reconciliation, the Australian Red Cross acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extended that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. We started this initiative with the guidance of the Australian Red Cross Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership team. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership team supports this research and partnership projects related to climate change and working alongside First Nations peoples. While thanking Jenny Brown, Linesha Johnson, and Lee Prowse, their knowledge, skills, thoughts, and feelings are the foundation of these initiatives. Here is a voice of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership team on climate change and their heritage.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were Australia's first explorers, first navigators, first engineers, first farmers, first botanists, first scientists, first diplomats, first astronomers, and first artists.
Walawani, Najinjuwan, Nagadagaya. Hello, and thank you. I am from the Wandiwandiang clan, one of the many that make up the Yuin Nation, and I'm guided by my spirit totem, the black cockatoo. I'm part of a strong kingship structure and bloodline. At Australian Red Cross, we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Nations, the traditional custodians of the land where we live, work, and travel. We pay respects to elders, past, present, and those who come in future. We honour their strong cultural and spiritual connection to land, waters, and sea. We acknowledge we live amongst the world's oldest living culture and carry their wisdom forward every day. The impact of climate change on First Nations people is very real and profound effect because of the deep engagement we have with animals, plants, land, and waters. My ancestors have left many footprints over this country. While growing up, my family were seasonal workers living off the land. We camped on riverbanks and swam in the waters. We knew the signs of seasonal change. We knew that seeing the wattle bloom was the best time to fish for bream. When the moon was dark was the best time for prawns. When we collected shellfish, we would return the shells to the waters to regenerate. We made baskets from the reeds and tools for hunting and gathering from the surrounding timbers. My ancestors would follow the Illawarra flame tree to guide their safe travels, and the totems would warn when the big winds, the rains, or the fires were encroaching. It is very different today with the pressure of climate change increasing. First Nations people have been marginalised in policy, negotiations, mitigation, and adaptation strategies, and this needs to change. The Research Red Cross engages with the inclusion of First Nations people on emerging technology to mitigate risk is very important for the future state. Traditionally, there were no borders. When elders travelled, they were permitted to enter into another's tribal land by elders through smoking ceremony or water blessing. This is a cultural protocol. Today,
I'm on the lands of the Awabakal people. I pay homage to their strong cultural knowledge and practice of land and waters, and their protection of flora and fauna. Walawani, Najinjuan, Nagaragaya.
Hello, my name's Lee Prowse. I'm here today to talk to you about the impact of climate change on our First Nations people. Climate change is bringing about heightened impact through disaster. This has a profound impact on our First Nations people, more than what we actually see in the news and in the papers and hear about. This goes beyond material things. It goes beyond mental health that's attributed to the impact of disaster. This goes to the core of our being. For First Nations people, connection to country is our soul. We talk about the land owning us. We don't own the land owns us. Therefore, it's our mother. And through that, we heal as a people. That connection, we heal as a people. The impact of disaster goes beyond what we see in the news, the material things, and the terrible, terrible impact on people as a whole. For us, it's actually about really taking us away from country, because when there's a disaster happening, we have to move off country. We move off country into areas that we might know, but what it actually is doing is moving us away from our spiritual home, whether it be for a short time or a long time. That really impacts on us as a people, really makes us vulnerable as both mentally and physical. As I said, it's easy to see the impact, the terrible impact for a town, a city. When it impacts on our country, what it is doing, it is actually taking away our traditional foods, our culture, and lots of cases, that connection. I guess it's probably easier to say it like this, when a fire, we'll use fire as an example, when a fire comes through and we have to leave because of that fire, we are at risk of losing thousands of years of culture and heritage. And it's getting worse as the impact of climate change gets even higher. We are actually moving off country and leaving behind our totems, our cultural practices, and our heritage. Things like birthing trees, knowledge trees, direction trees, all at risk through fire. If they go, we lose thousands of years of knowledge, understanding, and trees that have brought life for thousands of years. First Nations people on country, lots of us have more than 4 seasons. The unbalancing of seasonal change through climate change, of seasons through climate change, is affecting our spiritual law. It's affecting our hunting and gathering. It's affecting our dreams time story. And all this can be attributed to the impact of climate change. When we move off country, we leave that behind, because we can't do that, even though we still can do it in a I guess a psychological sense. To have our feet on Mother Earth makes it so much more grounding and powerful. We also have the opportunity to actually heal through being on country when we're there. Unfortunately, if we move off, that tends to heighten vulnerability for us as a people we actually tend to start to get those compounding factors such as mental health, physical health. We're moving from, lots of cases, from a regional remote area into an urban, regional, semi-regional environment that brings about change. It exposes us, exposes our vulnerability as a people to being unable to practice our culture in the traditional way. Lots of people in this country live in an urban environment. This means we're off country, we're away from country, we're removed from our country. Lots of times when we get people moving from their traditional Mother Earth country to another area, that connection is lost for a little while. And when that connection gets lost, people start to suffer. That's probably the biggest impact of climate change, is that suffering through having to migrate off country, whether it be for a short or a long term. And when we go back, our traditional ways of living have been impacted, and we have to actually go back and wait. And sometimes those totems, that traditional bush food, our traditional bush medicine, either takes a long time to come back or doesn't come back. And when it's lost forever. Thousands of years of being in culture and food are lost forever. I guess that's about all I can tell you, but just really want to emphasise the fact that disasters through climate change are really impactful on First Nations people, and can be contributing factors, or are contributing factors, to health problems, physical problems, and unfortunately it makes us really vulnerable as a people. Thank you.
In this demonstration, we mainly focus on our climate smart initiative from two perspectives. First, we will discuss this project as a demonstration of social justice in innovations and emerging technology. In this perspective, we discuss how this project helps collect and utilize knowledge, skills, feedback, thoughts, and emotions from the First Nations peoples related to climate change, while bringing social diversity, equity, and inclusion to emerging technology and mitigating risks and vulnerabilities. This project aligns with the Red Cross Strategy 2030, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and organizational ESG objectives. Further, we will discuss how this project aligns with national reconciliation and working alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Moreover, it will illustrate driving social justice with citizen science, volunteering, partnerships, data science, mobile communications, and AI. Secondly, this project demonstrates the success of our underlying AI governance toolkit for ESG and sustainability, which consists of a framework and a model. We innovated those tools to underpin social justice and ESG goals in AI, data science, and emerging technologies. We will discuss how those tools help AI for good programs, orchestrating people, culture, and mission towards sustainability, and driving partnerships and collaboration with industry, government, community, academics, and volunteers for social justice. Our illustration will help adapt this framework and the model for different AI projects and use them as a generic AI governance tools for ESG. Here is the overview of this presentation. First, we will discuss the Red Cross as a humanitarian organization. Then we will discuss climate change and First Nations peoples. We will talk about the strength of the First Nations peoples in climate resilience skills and include them in the climate smart projects. Further, we will speak about the risks related to climate change. Next, we will discuss the role of the emerging technology in climate change and mitigating risks related to First Nations peoples. After that, we will discuss the IFRC Strategy 2030 and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for sustainability. Afterward, we will talk about our innovative AI governance toolkit for driving social diversity, equity, and inclusion to solve sustainable development goals. We will identify climate action as an important sustainable goal. Subsequently, we discuss our innovative volunteer data science program. Further, we will discuss our technology partnership with the volunteers and the universities. Successively, we show how volunteers and partnerships support climate smart program and bring technology equity and inclusion for the First Nations peoples. Finally, we will present multiple success stories. The Red Cross mission is to prevent or reduce human suffering wherever it's found. We are guided by our 7 fundamental principles, which are humanity, unity, universality, neutrality, impartiality, independence, and volunteer service. We are the world's largest humanitarian movement operating in over 190 countries. We have over 17 million volunteers worldwide. We play an auxiliary role to the government, recognized as a reliable partner for mobilizing the power of humanity. Australia is facing a significant threat from climate change related to disasters. This includes bushfires, cyclones, heat waves, droughts, and floods. We draw this image to give some idea about the motivation. On the left side of the image, we illustrate bushfires and droughts and their causes and impact on the environment, society, economy, and lifestyle. As a case study, the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season was the worst in New South Wales. Several years of drought, above average temperature, and low moisture level enabled devastating bushfire across much of the state. Over the course of a few months, 26 lives were lost, over 2,000 homes were destroyed, and 5.5 million hectares of land was burned. The impact of New South Wales communities, farmers, local businesses, wildlife, and bushland was unprecedented. We identified that these impacts create a major threat to the health and well-being of indigenous communities and their ability to sustain their traditional life and cultural heritage. Further, we identified that the world's oldest continuing civilization, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, have unique solutions to these climate change-related disasters. As an example, Aboriginal communities' control burns can be stated. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal Australians manage their environment through control burns. Therefore, we believe that the inclusion of First Nations peoples in the climate smart initiatives is vital for mitigating their risks and vulnerabilities while providing a sustainable solution to climate change disasters. In this demonstration, we illustrate how our innovations enable the inclusion of First Nations people into climate smart program. These include, but not limited to, promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the climate smart program by bringing the First Nations people as stakeholders, enable diversity, equity, and inclusion in technology by bringing the First Nations people as citizen scientists, developing new technology and drive innovations for the First Nations people through emerging tech partnerships and volunteering. As you can see in the image and the title of the presentation, we want to enable equity and inclusion for First Nations peoples on emerging technology through citizen science to mitigate their risks related to climate change. Then we can create a prosperous world with human flourishing. This slide shows the Red Cross Strategy 2030, which consists of 3 goals, 5 challenges, and 7 transformations. This project aligns with all these 3 strategic layers. In terms of the goals, the project helps the First Nation people make them inclusive in the climate smart initiatives and provide equity in emerging technology. By addressing the First Nations people's climate resilience requirements, the project helps health and safety benefits for First Nations people by mitigating their risks and vulnerabilities related to climate change. Regarding the challenges, it is quite evident that this project is aligned with climate and environment crisis. This project minimizes the gap in the health and well-being of the First Nations people related to climate change. Further, it supports migration issues of the First Nations people between their cultural countries. Moreover, this project brings equity and inclusion for First Nations people regarding AI and technology transformation. It inspires communities, volunteers, and partners to take part in the climate smart and natural reconciliation action. Our newly formed innovative volunteer data science team and the university partnership and mentoring programs have established a distributed network supporting the Red Cross by mobilizing the humanity. The AI transformation which we lead takes the expected digital transformation an extra mile. Therefore, this project greatly supports the overall IFRC Strategy 2030. This slide will discuss United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a framework for environment, social, and governance, or ESG. This project supports multiple sustainable goals in the ESG framework. It supports the 13th Sustainable Development Goal of climate action, the 3rd Sustainable Development Goal of good health and well-being, the 17th Sustainable Development Goal of partnerships for the goals, the 10th Sustainable Development Goal of reducing inequalities, the 9th Sustainable Goal of industry innovations and infrastructure, and the 11th Sustainable Development Goal of sustainable cities and communities. We will show both the project outcomes and our AI and technology governance innovations establish a success story towards the Sustainable Development Goals. As stated before, this demonstration has two objectives related to two contributions. The first one is what we already discussed, the Climate Smart program. The second contribution is our AI governance toolkit for ESG for supporting sustainable development goals. Every project to be sustainable requires a solid foundation. Our Climate Smart program and the AI governance toolkit for ESG has synergy, which we will explain shortly. When understanding the importance of a good AI governance framework, the following 4 facts are important. They are: it is predicted that AI can contribute as much as 15.7 trillion to the world economy by 2030. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are also planned to achieve by 2030 in the areas critically important for humanity and the planet. AI could help achieve 79% of Sustainable Development Goals. From now until 2022, 85% of AI projects will fail due to bias in data, algorithms, or the teams responsible for managing them. Therefore, AI should be identified as a key enabler for climate resilience programs and other sustainable development goals. At the same time, the risks of failing AI is high and need appropriate governance. Therefore, we made our second contribution of developing an AI governance toolkit for ESG to support sustainable AI for sustainable development goals. Our AI governance toolkit mainly consists of 2 tools, which are Kite Abstraction Framework and Wind Turbine Conceptual Model. This framework and the model are inspired by our 7 fundamental principles: social diversity, equity, and inclusion in AI, sustainable development goals, ESG strategies, and AI for good and humanity. Our innovative Kite Abstraction Framework helps to drive the purpose of AI on ESG initiatives, addressing the key success factors of sustainability. It helps to orchestrate people, culture, and mission towards ESG. Let's listen to this whiteboard animation summarizing our Kite Abstraction Framework of AI governance for ESG.
Everything invented since the Industrial Revolution will be incorporated with AI by the year 2030. AI has been identified as a key enabler, supporting 79% of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This means from simple data point management to smart city development, different stakeholders will look into different perspectives in AI, such as governance, policies, social justice, culture, ethics, strategy, technology, compliance, and sustainability. These perspectives are addressed in a set of standards, frameworks, and metrics which is referred to as Environment, Social, and Governance, or ESG. It will be the new strategy for corporate social responsibility. The Red Cross is driving AI for sustainability by mobilizing the power of humanity. We are collaborating with industry, government, community, academics, and volunteers in AI for sustainability. Our AI strategy is to enhance social justice by mitigating AI risks and driving AI benefits for humanity. The Red Cross innovative KITE conceptualized abstraction framework helps reduce the complexities in AI when addressing ESG. It enables driving AI for sustainability in more structured, systematic, transparent, and collaborative ways. The leaders can adopt this framework to drive the purpose of AI initiatives addressing the key success factors. Irrespective of the complexity of the AI application, this framework analyzes the 4 key dimensions of 1. AI, 2. Organization, 3. Society, and 4. Sustainability. The interdependencies of these dimensions enable addressing of AI strategy, AI for good, and social diversity, equity, and inclusion in AI. It supports the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Further, it helps organizational governance and responsibilities by guiding the orchestration of people, culture, and AI mission towards sustainability. Ultimately, this abstraction framework can underpin sustainable AI for sustainability.
On the other hand, our innovative wind turbine conceptual AI governance model helps driving AI for sustainability and humanity. It supports partnerships, volunteering, and community engagement towards achieving sustainable development goals. Further, it supports the Red Cross mission and promotes social diversity, equity, and inclusion for social justice. Let's listen to this whiteboard animation summarizing our wind turbine conceptual AI governance model for sustainability and humanity.
Artificial intelligence is the new electricity. To make AI sustainable, the focus on people, processes, and outcomes are important. AI could help to achieve 79% of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. The Red Cross 7 fundamental principles can enhance social diversity, equity, and inclusion in AI development. They are humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, unity, universality, and voluntary service. These 2 foundations can be unified to strengthen the mission driving AI for sustainability. The Red Cross Innovative Wind Turbine Conceptualized Model illustrates a collaborative framework for the good governance of AI for sustainability. It drives the mission towards social justice. Its process is guided by Red Cross personnel. The front-faced multi-blade rotor represents the 7 fundamental principles that address AI ethics. The wheels in the gearbox represent the diversified community, volunteers, and partners who are continually helping in this great course with skills and resources. The generator represents the data and AI capabilities that drive AI transformation. As illustrated in the model, the Red Cross IT and data governance capabilities ensure data privacy, security, and compliance. Data science and AI capabilities promote social diversity, equity, and inclusion. This includes citizen scientists, volunteer data scientists, and AI for Good partnerships. The data science tools, platforms, and processes empower skilled human resources, including staff, citizen scientists, volunteers, and partners. The AI projects focus on sustainable development goals, such as climate change, First Nations peoples, vulnerable migrants, international humanitarian law, and AI for good. Ultimately, we all can drive sustainable AI for humanity and sustainability.
Through the KITE framework and the wind turbine conceptualized model, the Australian Red Cross enhances diversity, equity, and inclusion in AI initiatives by engaging with partners, volunteers, and community. Therefore, our initiatives are mutually beneficial for society while minimizing the biases and risks with diversified stakeholders. We established an innovative volunteer data science team for the first time, with industry collaborations focused on AI for sustainability and transformation. It helped us to enhance resources and capabilities to support ESG goals. I would like to present a short video we developed for the last World Red Cross Day related to our volunteer data science team. The video theme was Together We Are Unstoppable. The volunteer data science team support immensely for the Smart Climate program.
The Red Cross has already invested so much in innovation and technology that we were able to leverage from the latest technology like cloud platform. We were able to set something up quickly to ensure that the data is available and accessible.
We recognize the Australian Red Cross as an organization which has provided the community a tremendous service over the years. Focused on global reach through local action, including inspiring goals, significant global challenges, and several changes, including digital transformation planned for 2030, I believe that the Australian Red Cross would be able to shed some light on how their big data initiatives are supporting these efforts.
Along these lines, we can work together with the Red Cross to provide benefit.
In this collaboration work with Red Cross, the main objective is to serve humanity by bringing our research outcomes to the social benefits.
Also, this collaboration will help humanity by uplifting data-informed decision-making capabilities for charities.
Working with these kind of important organizations really brings the emphasis on what kind of problems we can solve today and that we really make a difference.
This project has given me the opportunity to make a valuable contribution to a project that I am genuinely interested in, and a project which I know has the potential to improve the lives of everyday Australians and also the world at a greater capacity.
A year back, to understand the climate change impact on ecology and society, we conducted a Delphi method by interviewing researchers who work closely with the environment. We hypothesized that climate change caused not only greatly visible bushfires or drought kind of effects, but also significant changes in ecology and biodiversity, which can impact on indigenous communities to sustain their traditional life. You can find the gravity of these impacts by listening to the following two interviews. In the first interview, Dr. Udita Wijetunga, a researcher from a renowned SHINE lab at the University of Sydney, explained how climate change impacts ecosystem and biodiversity. Let's listen to her.
It is good to hear about this project related to climate change as it is a global challenge. My research at University of Sydney was about one of the world's worst invasive species, which is the cane toad, Rhinella marina. This animal was introduced to tropical Australia in 1935, and it has been widely spreading around that area since then. And I did my research along the southern parts of Australia where the cooler climate is. I studied the consequence of abiotic conditions, specifically the temperature, on various life stages of this invasive cane toad. My field studies show that the available ponds often average around 20 degrees Celsius, which is 10 degrees Celsius lower than in many areas of the toad's native range or its Australian tropics. However, with the climate change, the rise of temperature can affect the pond temperature increase and provide suitable breeding grounds for these invasive toads. So this can lead these introduced species to spread further to the southern parts of Australia. This gradual movement can adversely affect the biodiversity of that novel environment, because many species in that environment, specifically the predators, have not exposed to these newly introduced animals, and that can adversely affect the food chain, and ultimately it can affect the natural balance of that novel environment.
In the second interview, Professor Jacqueline Troy, the Director of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research, and Professor Craig Ginn, the Director of the Computing and Audio Research Lab at the University of Sydney, discuss with us how climate change can impact natural soundscape and cause significant impacts on First Nations people's psychology and well-being. Let's listen to Professor Craig Ginn's hypothesis on this research, followed by the discussion.
Hi everyone, my name is Craig Ginn, and it's a great opportunity to volunteer with the Red Cross and link some university research efforts with the efforts of the Red Cross Serving Humanity. I am Director of the Computing and Audio Research Laboratory here at the University of Sydney, and our lab has over 2 decades of experience in acoustic science and engineering. As an example of our work, we have contributed a spatial hearing aid algorithm for the Starkey hearing aid branded as Acuity Immersion in the commercial context. Climate change is an important research focus to mitigate future risk and vulnerabilities to societies. Along these lines, we can work together with the Red Cross to provide benefit. In particular, we are exploring acoustic measurements of the ecological soundscape in regions of Australia sensitive to climate change. The ecological soundscape can provide information related to the social, cultural, and ecological aspects of climate change. In this perspective, we are focusing on the fact that climate change poses a major threat to the health of Indigenous communities and their ability to sustain their traditional life, language, and cultural heritage. Therefore, we intend to monitor the effects of climate change via its impact on ecological soundscapes around Indigenous communities. As a proof of concept, we are planning to measure the acoustics of natural habitats around Indigenous communities and also measure the acoustics within the Indigenous community. In this way, we can explore the interrelationship between the ecological aspects and the social and cultural aspects of climate change. Thank you very much.
Well, so I'm an associate professor at the University of Sydney, and I work in acoustics and audio. So I head the Computing and Audio Research Lab. So, and I'm also a volunteer for Red Cross now through Mahendra, and we've been speaking about soundscape ecology and climate change. And so we've been having a look at that. And so I've just put together a little set of slides here. So basically, it's a relatively new field. Really, it's been around since the 1960s, but really modernized in 2011. So it's called soundscape ecology. And it's just like landscape ecology, where you're looking at, you know, animals and species and interaction with the landscape. And now we're including sound into that. And so it's just having a look at these things. So there's the landscape, there's climate that impacts onto this, and then you have a number of things. There's natural events, natural populations, and natural geophysical things. You have soundscape patterns, and you have human activities that, of course, impact in both ways going through those things. And so if you record sounds, you can get what's called, I mean, they have these terms now, it's called biophony, geophony, or anthrophony. So, I mean, basically, you can have sounds related to animals, sounds related to the planet itself, and sounds related to humans. And these are all interacting, and it's an interesting new field. And there's a lot of research areas in this field. So it's not what I'd say, you know, fully developed or anything like that. So it's relatively new. Areas of research in there is like measurement and quantification. How do you do it well? Spatial temporal dynamics, environmental covariance, human impacts on soundscapes, impacts on human, so the soundscape impact on human, and the impact on wildlife as well. So we've highlighted 2 areas here. Environmental covariance and impact on humans is an area of focus with respect to the climate change that we're looking at. And so just to speak a little bit about that, so we are posing to do some recordings. So, I mean, there's biophonic and geophonic sounds. So these will vary according to environmental factors. So it's weather, plant, and animal phenology. This is a term which I've defined down here. So you can look at the periodic events life cycles of animals and also of the planet and species and so forth, and how these are influenced by seasonal and interannual variations in climate and habitat, and there's various other things: solar radiation, lunar radiation, humidity, heating days, moisture budgets, and all of these things. So all of these things can be recorded or have an impact on sound, and so that's the environmental covariance. And then of course there's the impact on humans. So sense of place of attachment, connection to nature. I mean, it goes both ways. There's demographic variables such as culture, place of residence, age, human values, and all of these reflect natural sounds. And so this is within the soundscape ecology, but there's also, I mean, the bioacoustics and cultural landscapes and recordings, they all merge. I think we're focusing more on soundscape ecology, but there's also the cultural soundscape, which is quite important. So the cultural soundscape is significant for any cultural identity, really. It's the sonic values of both traditions and contemporary daily cultures. So it's looking at sounds as oral symbols of daily and tangible culture, what we eat, what we listen to, how we practice our religion, who we are, connects people to their land by the way of auditory experiences that invoke memories of past lives, families, and things like that. There is some work in measuring soundscapes. People have done it more for the Aboriginal culture in Canada. I haven't seen actually that many. I know that there are people collecting sounds of here, but I was looking more for soundscapes and really recording. And it's not the music per se of Aboriginal culture, but we're really just looking at everyday sounds of society, everyday sounds. It's part of the cultural heritage that exists, and that's not well recorded. So clearly climate change is something that's happening. I don't know if you've seen this new article in The Guardian by someone working with the UN, really posting a bleak, really quite a bleak article today in The Guardian. But anyway, so there's many locations that are going to be impacted, and this is a website that shows that Indigenous Australians do respond to climate change. They have quite a bit of knowledge as well, and there's many areas to have a look. And if you go to this site here, there's many different examples. Mahendra and I were sort of targeting tropical northern Australia. It's going to be one of the locations that's going to get very, very hot. So it's probably going to get, it's one of the regions that are going to get the hottest. There's also a very nice study. So I've just posted a picture from that study. It's done by the government. So there's clear risks there, and a good study that supports what's happening there. So it's, it's home to 87,000 Indigenous people. I say it's about a quarter of the total population. A lot of them live near the coast and offshore. Climate change is just going to affect everything there. It looks like carbon dioxide levels is going to affect plants. It's going to affect the human and natural systems, low-lying settlements, estuarine ecosystems, coral reefs, marine food chains, and so forth. And so, in that area, if you look at what people are saying, there's particular areas that are going to be particular populations that are particularly vulnerable. So there's something near here. What is that saying? Port Headland. I don't know the areas, but so this study is indicating, for example, around Broome here. This is Halls Creek. So there are areas that are particularly that have people who are particularly vulnerable to the change that's going to happen. And so we've been speaking about trying to do a soundscape recordings, and so I mean it's got to span a long period of time, and it's got to have other data as well, but it's a great time to do something like this. The technology is sort of there, and in addition there's a lot of good reasons to do this. So we're looking to record ecological soundscapes for research purposes. As I already said, there's a lot of research areas in ecological soundscape or soundscape ecology, but we're targeting climate change in Aboriginal culture. And so we do want to get access to accurate climate data, so that's going to associate with our soundscape recordings. We definitely want to record anthrophony. So we want to get sounds related to Aboriginal culture. We'd have to identify what are the impacts and issues around that area. We know that they don't like photos taken, but sounds may be a bit different. But this is really to preserve their culture, the soundscape culture, and what it's like to live there. It's just normal daily people sounds in their gatherings, different things like that. And that sort of thing would be easy to analyze in a soundscape recording as well. And then what we can do is we would be looking to place recordings in culturally significant surroundings near where people would congregate and stuff like that. So we would have also sounds from the landscapes of the biophony and geophony, which we could then try and correlate with the measurements that we would get from the anthrophony that we would measure. So if there are changes, and again, we would have to be looking for long time scales here. So we're looking to do research. We're talking on the order of decades here when we're trying to get this type of data, and we can correlate those, and then obviously relate that to climate change as we can measure the impacts of climate change and we see changes. And this is going to provide society a way to hear. I do want to get some photos as well of the changes in the regions that we're recording, but it's going to give society a way to hear the impacts of climate change, which, it's always good to make things closer so that people get more closer to what the impacts, what's happening. And if you can hear something and see something, then obviously it's going to make more impact upon you. So this is what we've been talking about so far, and so we are hoping to get this together. I'm currently looking to purchase several of these devices here. So these were made at the University of Oxford. They're easy to get. They've got weather housing as well. It can go to ultrasonic frequencies, though I don't know if we require that or not. We would require that if there are bats in the relevant area, then we might want to go to the ultrasonic frequencies. If not, then we wouldn't need to do that. Mahendra and I have been talking about, setting some up in our backyard just to calibrate them and do various things, but our concern is we need to put these in remote areas, and we need to target the correct areas, and we would need people to help us with switching the audio card, switching the batteries and stuff like that. So while the technology is there and it's easy, it still requires some maintenance and so forth. So that's sort of where the project is sitting now. This is what we've been talking about, and so I'm quite keen on doing this as a research project, but also then to involve the Red Cross in any way that would be appropriate from their point of view. So I might leave it there and try and get some feedback.
It'll be interesting to see whether, like you're talking about, you may do some interviews or something, but you may want to incorporate the kinds of sounds. If you're picking up on incidental sounds, if you like, the kind of social sounds, one of the things Aboriginal people do, and this is what I was talking about in the last meeting, is we do all over the world, and some of the things you would pick up incidentally are actually quite constructed performative things, right? Yeah. So immediately coming to mind, absolutely directly related to this project, is another project that I've got with the National Taiwan University that we've been working up recently to develop a conference to be held later next year about vulnerable populations and their ability to deal with disaster and crisis. So that is absolutely relevant to what you're talking about, particularly from Red Cross's point of view. And I think it would be very interesting to have a discussion with you, Mahendra, about whether Red Cross would also like to have some kind of engagement with this thing we're proposing with University of California, Berkeley, looking at migrant populations. There are specialists there who look at migrants and vulnerability, but also the capacity to push back in times of crisis and disaster. My colleague from SWAT, North Pakistan, and the rest of my team who are Australian focused and Aboriginal Australian. So there's that. In terms of people using acoustic sensors to pick up environmental information and using it, I think of Nadi Simpson, who runs the Barriagal Choir, which is it's a kind of Sydney University exercise out of the Conservatorium of Music again. But Nadi Simpson is as an Aboriginal musician, In fact, she's just written a book called Song of the Crocodile. You might want to have a look at that book. She uses environment acoustic sensors to pick up sounds and then turn it into musical practice. And she's looking specifically at what kind of sounds come from environment that is of significance to Aboriginal people. So Nadi Simpson is someone that you should perhaps have a talk to and should know about. I'm thinking about Michael Mossman over in our School of Architecture. He is somebody who looks at, well, he's just worked on this project at Sydney University called DHUWAR, DHUWARR, which is the word for grains, one of the words for grains anyway, in the language of the Gamilaroi people in Western New South Wales. That project is looking at growing grain from traditional endemic Australian grasses and then processing that into food. So creating a kind of sustainable future with our own native grasses. So going back to grains that are kind of the more genetically engineered grains that we now rely on so much.
And I think how we rely on just a few grains, isn't it? Whereas we used to have so many grains we used to eat.
I know. In fact, that's one of the things I love about going into North Pakistan, and I'm sure, Mahendra, you would say the same thing in Sri Lanka, is that whenever you get into a community area, particularly where they use unleavened bread, or make unleavened bread, you know, they don't use yeast, and these are these lovely flat breads.
Yeah,
that smell off them that they have, like there's nothing like going past a tandoor where somebody's cooking these beautiful breads, and because they have local grains in them too, that in that Indus area where I go to, there are remnant traditional grains, of course. So but anyway, there's a place that you might be interested to place some sensors would be connected to that DHUWAR project, which is out at Narrabri. And the sound of the grass and the grains would be a really interesting thing. And the Aboriginal community is right nearby and they're engaging with it. So Michael Mossman from Architecture is also interested in, of course, the kind of constructed environment that Aboriginal people live in. And he works with his own Yarrabah community in North Queensland up in the Cape. He would, I think, be somebody that would be very interested to talk with you about perhaps where to place some sensors and have a good connection into his own community. Again, the Narrabri, the Gamilaroi may very well be interested in this.
Well, that's really positive, because if he's local, then we can easily talk to him. And then if there's a place here, we could sort of do a little test of how things work, you know, very close to us.
And you know, like I think it would be good to start with our own local Redfern and Glebe communities.
Absolutely.
And you know, I've got a great connection with a lovely young man called Joel Davison, who is Gadigal. And he recently wrote the lyrics for the song Gadigal that Midnight Oil performed and won a lot of awards for. And he lives in inner city Sydney on his Gadigal country. So Joel is coming to, we have a thing called a knowledge feast that's going to be on the 25th of November, and Joel's going to come and read his, or speak to his poem, Gadigal, and he would be I think he'd be a great person for you to engage with as well, Joel. So just
Absolutely.
And Janelle Evans, who is in our Sydney College of the Arts, so she's a Sydney traditional owner Aboriginal person from Western Sydney, so she would identify as Daruk out that way, Daruk. And she's an artist who also uses soundscapes. So because I've got a background in the arts, we used to talk about these things as soundscapes, of course, where you can create soundscapes from all kinds of things. And in the past, I've worked with a man called Paul Carter, who is a very famous soundscapes person, and we worked together to create the soundscape at the entrance to the Sydney Museum of Sydney on the site of First Government House. And also there's a sculpture out the front of it called The Edge of the Trees, done by Fiona Foley and another artist, I think, who works also, I think, with soundscapes or with, you know, the kind of sound that you're thinking about collecting as well. Environmental acoustics, I love that terminology. Janet Lawrence, who's a person who does environmental installations, but as an artist, recently had an exhibition last year at the Museum of Contemporary Art about trees and forests. But there's that in that sculpture, The Edge of the Trees at the Museum of Sydney, MOS as it's called, down near Circular Quay, has these. They look like poles, but they're meant to be the sort of shapes of trees, and they have sounds coming out of them, including the language of the Sydney area. So that I helped with. So doing it to capture things like engagement with the environment and change in the environment and that sort of. So these are people who are switched on, if you like, to the idea of environmental, who are using it in their own practice, including for a range of purposes that engage with changes to the world of Aboriginal peoples, you know, through climate, but also through invasion and everything else. Now, in my own country, which is the Snowy Mountains, the high country of southeastern Australia, the only alpine country in Australia, there have been significant changes, and that would be a place where I recommend that you could potentially put sensors. So things like the bogong moth, which is culturally significant to my people. In the past, we had big feasts where people would eat these moths. And the moth has gone from being very large to being smaller to being larger again. Of course, as the climate heats up, it will change the nature of the alpine country, because it depends. It's basically glacial, and it's very late end of the Ice Age country. So the other people that I deal with in the north of the world, in Swat, they still have glaciers in the Hindu Kush, which is part of the Himalayas, and their glaciers are melting as well at a greater rate. They have just had a massive flood, the second huge flood, destructive flood in the Swat River in the last 10 years. Now, the previous flood in 2010, there'd been nothing like that in living memory. And they've had another one within 10 years. So that's again a direct result of climate change. So, you know,
well, I think it's quite dire, really. I've been reading several articles.
Stuff, but people have I've got this kind of mountain alliance, if you like. I've got colleagues and friends in Chile and South America. And you know, of course, that running out of water in the Andes, which is crazy, because they depend on the melt. It's the same thing. Australia's busily building a second hydroelectric scheme, moving on to the third. You know, it'd be interesting to have sensors, you know, the destruction of the country, anticipation of creating hydroelectric power in a place where we're going to, I mean, on the continent that's drying up probably faster than anywhere else in the world. We have less water than anywhere else in the world. And my country is all about frozen water that liquefies, you know, with the melt. And I've just been reconstructing a song of my country that was documented in 1834, and it looks like it's a snow increase ceremony song. So we want to re-practice this ceremony. So these are the kinds of responses that Aboriginal people are having. We're looking at ways to, you know, bring back our own practices. So that leads me to another two people I would suggest are interesting to talk to. One is Dean Freeman, and he's one of a number of Aboriginal people who are doing cultural burns. So of course the acoustics that would have been good to pick up this year, if you didn't already, of course, were the fires. Yeah, you know, so Dean and a number of other people in southeastern Australia and also elsewhere in Australia are doing cultural burns. This has been a big, an ongoing practice up in the top end, where it hasn't really been interrupted well, it's been interrupted, but people have kept that practice going. But in southeastern Australia, it's coming back into practice, and some people are saying that the cultural burns that were done around Canberra protected the city this time from being burnt as it was in 2003, 2002. So I think that would be he'd be an interesting, that'd be one kind of person who would be interesting to talk to, the Aboriginal park rangers, and particularly people here in the southeast. In northwest of Western Australia, in Yawuru country, Yawuru, at Broome, there is called Peter Yu, and Peter has now become the Professor Director for the National Centre for Indigenous Studies down in at the Australian National University. And Peter and the Yawuru Corporation have been working with other people also across the Kimberley and the Pilbara to look at the changes in the environment as a result of climate change to the flowering of plants, which then has impact on animals breeding, the kinds of things that people collect at different times of year. They found that there's actually a shift. So things are flowering later. Was the last that I heard about this. Now, the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies has had some ongoing projects, I think, with the Aboriginal native title representative bodies up in that area, prescribed bodies, corporate. I think the Yawuru Corporation is one of them. But so you might have a look at the IATSIS research on climate change. But looking back to how Aboriginal people manage country, also through performance, because we did do these things like sing, what we call we had increase ceremony that involved people singing and chanting. Again, this is something all around the world Indigenous people do, is they invoke the environment, they invoke the ancestors, they invoke ways to mitigate against disaster and to keep the things we want to keep going. One of the things happening as a direct result of climate change, and a very Aboriginal communities worldwide, as far as I'm concerned, are embracing this idea of managing climate change and seeing it as a catastrophe, and themselves as vulnerable populations, but also looking at saying, well, we know how to manage the environment in a way that other people don't. So everything from the grasses to grains, Narrabri Project, the Wire of Sydney, to Michael Mossman and the way in which we live on country, the houses we build, the structures we build, this grasses and grains project of creating a better food source, Jacinta's understanding the ceremony of country and being attuned to country, and also how to manage it. She's talking about clearing, now that the fires have actually cleared a lot of stuff off country that traditionally we would have cleared all the time. How do we keep that nice clear? How do we keep the forests clear, the bush clear? Also, how do we revive the ceremony, which is actually a way of connecting people to country? So it's, whether or not you believe it invokes anything, what it does do is connect people to country and give people an awareness of their environment that the wider community just doesn't have. For most of the wider community, it's whether or not something's appearing seasonally in their supermarket or not. And most of these things now are not seasonal anyway. You can have strawberries all year round, mangoes all year, it's most people.
Yeah, that's the point. So
people would have no sense of
season. They don't have a connection, that's right. So that's why we're very interested in social aspects as the climate changes, because it does have a much more direct impact. And then
there's people like Nadi Simpson and Janelle Evans who are picking up the use of, using acoustic sensors to collect sound and then turn it directly into music. Nadi particularly, she gave a presentation last year at the Conservatorium of Music a piece of music that she created just using sounds she'd recorded. And she talks about it, the sound of trees breathing and the sounds of, you know, the ground creaking and all this sort of, so that's what she's looking for, the micro sounds. So back to your high frequency. So another thing in my country where your high frequency technology, well, you could look at the high frequency acoustics, that we have a bat that is very sensitive to climate change. It's not a flitter, is it a flitter bat? It's like, it's a kind of flitter bat. It's a very small bat that is based out of caves in Wee Jasper. And very soon, every year, I think it's in late summer, these bats migrate before the winter. I think there's it's Wee Jasper bat, if you look, but that would be another thing that would be very interesting to get an acoustic, you know, to put your sensors near where they, because they, you know, they're very noisy for bats.
Yeah.
But they would be much noisier if you could actually hear the their sounds, because they're sounds that are beyond the human. Most of them are out of the range of human hearing. So, and that's traditional for us as Aboriginal people, those bats, the moths. I mean, can you hear the moths? I don't know. This is the time of year where they're pupating. I mean, they're coming out of their pupation. And
well, the bats might eat the moths, though, wouldn't they, Mikey?
Yeah, in fact, you're dead right. That's what they do. They come, there's a kind of, you know, but the moths, they pupate in the cracks of the granite rocks, the glacial rocks, and then they, you know, come out in a kind of a rush. So they're coming out now. So it'd be very interesting to set up some sensors. The big picture for you would be there are places that wouldn't necessarily have high frequency of Aboriginal engagement, but like the high country, there's very few of us anyway. But our core areas are Cooma, Tumbarumba, you know, that we don't live in the kind of clustered community that you get with, say, people who live out on the lands and maybe camping together for a week or something like that. But we do go and do things together. But it would be more kind of sites of activity of significance. So it'd be very interesting over a longitudinal period to record the sounds of the bats and the moths. And it may be that these bats they've already had quite a bit of, well, there's been research done about the bats and about the moths, but I don't think there's much ongoing research. There's almost nothing done up in the high country, not even any archaeology. That's, you know, we do things that are different to what other Aboriginal people do because we're from a different area, you know. So, and we kind of cluster ourselves around in Australia. You probably know these terms. People talk about being saltwater, freshwater, desert, and ice mob. So we are the ice people. So people talk about us. There's ice, freshwater, saltwater, and desert. So they're the sounds of my country are different to the sounds of. And then there's these urban sites like Redfern. I mean, you could just record Redfern, but I don't know that Redfern and climate change and vulnerability necessarily. I don't know how.
That's what I have to try and put. But I like the story of your bats, though. I mean, that's quite interesting. So I mean, because that's definitely nature, and that's definitely could be changing with climate change. And if you say it's sensitive,
the moss, the bogong moss, B-O-G-O, they spell them as B-O-G-O-N-G in English, bogong. Yeah. Well, lovely to meet you both, and I think it sounds like a great idea, and very interested in the whole premise of what you're doing. So
yeah, well, you've been a fountain of knowledge.
Oh no, that's all right. It's my job.
Thank you very much for both of you. Thank you.
No worries. Great.
Bye.
Bye. We presented our research initiatives on soundscape ecology and climate change for supporting First Nations people's health and well-being at the Climate Red Summit last year. Here is the flyer of that session. You can watch that recorded session via YouTube for more information. Now we turn to an industry partnership with the UNSW. Based on our experience and strategy, We established this partnership to enabling equity and inclusion for First Nations peoples on emerging technology through citizen science to mitigate their risks related to climate change. We incorporate the IFRC Strategy 2030, UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the novel AI governance toolkit to drive this partnership. Through this partnership, the Australian Red Cross mentored the university students to lead the climate smart and resilience projects with emerging technologies and national reconciliation goals. Further, we drive these projects by promoting citizen science to enable diversity, equity, and inclusion in technology and solutions. The Australian Red Cross Data Science and Analytics team collaborated with Dr. Yenny Tim, Director Sandbox Education Program, and Dr. George Jockharder, Lecturer in Information Systems and Technology Management at the UNSW Business School. Now let's listen to Dr. George Jockharder's reflection on this Sustainability Partnership project, followed by 2 showcases of students' projects enabling equity and inclusion for First Nations peoples on emerging technology through citizen science to mitigate their risks related to climate change.
Thank you, Mahendra, for the nice introduction. It is a privilege to addressing the IFRC Planet Red Summit 2021. I want to express our sincere thanks to the Australian Red Cross for the partnership. Through this partnership between the Australian Red Cross and UNSW Sandbox program, we have been working mutually towards achieving sustainability through technology and innovation related to climate smart and supporting First Nations people's needs and concerns. Over the last 2 years, and through this partnership in this interactive education program, our students research a major problem facing First Nations community, which is climate change. In addition to mitigating the climate change risk, our students promote diversity, equity, and inclusion for First Nations people on emerging technology by bringing them as citizen scientists. Our students were in contact with volunteers to understand their feelings, their thoughts, and their fears about climate change. And students did multiple projects to bring this emerging technology to First Nations people. On top of providing students with opportunities to learn, these projects provided tangible value to the communities. The Australian Red Cross and the Sandbox program are willing to continue collaborating and exploring new ideas and incorporate students as extended resources to prototype these ideas across multiple collaborative projects rolled. So these projects are also an opportunity to introduce potential new talents and extend these talents resources to communities and charities. This collaboration between the Australian Red Cross and UNSW contributed to the UN SDG 17, which is strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. A big thank you to the Australian Red Cross for providing this mentoring and partnership initiative to help social justice.
Our project aims to monitor the effects of climate change on Indigenous communities regarding their health, heritage and lifestyle values in order to sustain and preserve their culture, whilst also bringing awareness to climate change and the community group themselves.
And the reason we're doing this is there is an abundance or a lack thereof of effective monitoring solutions. And what's happening is it's blurring our vision and our understanding of how the environment is impacting them.
Our solution is to create a mobile application that allows individuals to make entries related to the specific climate change implication that they have observed, and then also to comment on the effects they believe that this implication can have on their community, their cultural heritage and the environment around them. To promote engagement, we propose to implement a reward system. The rewards will be linked to local Indigenous businesses promoting cultural awareness. This project has given me the opportunity to make a valuable contribution to a project that I am genuinely interested in, and a project which I know has the potential to improve the lives of everyday Australians and also the world at a greater capacity.
It's more personal to us than just, I'm getting a preset scenario from a textbook, like Vincent has said earlier. And because it's so personal to us and because we can actually relate to it, it allows us to, have a more personal connection, allows us to really, get the creative juices flowing so we can make the best projects possible.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joseph, one of the developers who created the application, and I'll be taking you through an in-depth demonstration of our MVP's main functionalities alongside some user stories to give you an example of what our solution is capable of. The application was co-developed with Ethan, whilst the design was meaningfully crafted by both Alison and I. Before I begin, I'd like to point out that the backgrounds you'll see throughout the demo are a set of Indigenous-related imagery, like art, locations, and people, which is purposely included to improve the sense of community found within the application. Additionally, the majority of dummy data displayed in the demo is being transmitted directly from an online database. That is to say, our MVP is fully functional and syncs across multiple devices. With our solution's main objective being the mobilization of citizen science to mitigate climate change risk, I'd like to begin by showcasing our survey system, the core of our application. The structure behind entries that a user makes is split into 3 sections. 1, data on environmental observations. 2, their geographical location. And the last, opinions on the state of Indigenous health, culture, and well-being. As you can see, we've aimed to keep entries short and concise so that users are able to document events they see in real time and to keep the engagement levels high, an issue which often plagues longer surveys. The split into a 2-page survey gives users breathing room, whilst a single input type helps to ensure that files generated for analysis follow a consistent structure. We also took into account the data that we'd be receiving and how we can structure our surveys to provide the most meaningful information possible to the scientists who request it. By combining data from all sections, scientists are gaining an understanding of the impact of climate change on Indigenous heritage, but also local in real-time environmental events that may be impacting upon these measures. To ensure integrity when dealing with citizen science, we've optimized for bad data isolation as well, meaning we've simplified the process of identifying and flagging poor quality and inappropriate data that some may send. Imagine you are Clive Bell, a 30-year-old scientist employed by CSIRO to analyze data to find rainfall patterns and trends within Brumbies Lake. As a climate scientist, you would want to be able to monitor data on community sentiment and rainfall levels within the area so that you can build accurate data models, inform residents of the best strategies to prepare for extreme weather, and involve resident feedback in policy creation. This can be achieved by extracting data from custodian's database and thanking users for their data through the message and feed system, whilst also sharing the extent of the impact in order to encourage them to continue contributing. But what about the surrounding aspects of the application? For this, we decided upon the implementation of an account system, which looks at factors like gender and Indigenous descent. By collecting this, we further enhance the quality of our data, providing context behind the people that are posting what entries. Alongside this, a history function gives users the chance to look back and reflect on their journey observing the environment and the state of the Indigenous community, which we've taken the opportunity to innovate on by generating intrinsic motivators. When entries have been analyzed, users receive visual stimuli indicators and thank you messages from respective analysts viewable in the profile page. This exists to inform users, to let them know that they're doing good in the world. Perhaps our biggest innovation, however, is actually our points system, which aims to provide users direct and tangible incentives for their contribution. Each time a user makes an entry, they receive points, which ranks them on a leaderboard visible on the home page. But these points serve a more important function, which are acting as a currency for rewards. By partnering with the government alongside local communities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses, we allow users to trade in points they've obtained for various prizes, like discounts. Now picture this. You are Kiara Lee, a 32-year-old mother of 3 seeking to remain involved within your community. You hope to instill a strong sense of connection, heritage, and culture amongst your children. As a community member, you would want to be able to pass down your culture's rich heritage and traditions so that you can ensure the preservation of the Indigenous belonging, connection to the land, and other Indigenous people within your family. This can be achieved by buying products and investing time into Indigenous-owned businesses and events using the vouchers, and contributing to local environment observations with respect to the health of Indigenous traditions. Given the ample time we had to devise and develop our application, we were able to include a news and events function visible on the home page. News delivers important information relevant on a national scale, whilst the events section encapsulates all the significant Indigenous-related activity within your local area, viewable with just a simple click. This means that users can stay up to date with what's going on in the community around their glance. For the purposes of the MVP, news and events link directly to website articles. But in the future, we hope to create a converter that allows users to read articles directly in-app, perhaps interacting with them in some way. Put yourself in the shoes of Mr. Warwick Jones, a 45-year-old community engagement manager looking to promote Indigenous-related community events like bushland cleanups within youth. As a community manager, you would want to be able to create exposure for community events through a platform popular with the youth so that you can engage them in Indigenous traditions. This could be achieved by marketing the event on the app's homepage and using rewards like entry discounts to encourage youth to participate. Once again, I would like to reiterate the importance of the fully functional aspect of our MVP application, which allows us to test queries on the unstructured data received. I'll leave things to Alison, who will now elaborate further on the UI and UX design choices we've made.
The design of Custodian used the 10 Nielsen heuristics to basically align with the user requirements and knowledge across the two diverse user groups. We wanted to ensure that redeeming rewards was an easy process, as not many people may be used to redeeming rewards online. So to do this, we made sure that the status of whether you could afford a reward was color-coded by a blue circle on the bottom right, and this made it clear of the system status. We also used a navigation bar throughout the whole app to make it easier to switch from your profile page, adding an entry, and using the home dashboard as well. Error messages were also used to help users recover if they accidentally entered an empty data field, as displayed on the right image. By being able to look at also keeping a consistent and clean design, we also made sure that things were easily identifiable, as seen by the post history, where it's easy to identify what is a post and looking what is a message as well. Following this, we wanted to make sure that adding new entries was a fast and easy process as well, as exemplified by the consistent design of the sentiment sliders that exhibit the community's thoughts and feelings about how climate change is affecting them as well. We also wanted to make sure that creating an account was an easy process by providing constant help buttons to allow for help and documentation to progress with the process. Tested these functionalities against two different use cases as per the Agile process to ensure any bugs or issues were caught out early before the initial rollout phase. In the initial rollout of Custodian, we plan to market in collaboration with local and Indigenous businesses and organizations to widen the engagement with diverse user groups. The gamification element also will be a sole focus to ensure that users understand that being able to redeem rewards for the efforts kept on a consistent basis to continue returning to the app. Financially, we wanted to ensure that we had proposed partnerships with government bodies and non-for-profit sectors within the same interests, and being able to exemplify that impact that Custodian's purpose is making. We also wanted to ensure that leaderboard was kept as a long-term feature to ensure that users continue to build a community and friendly competition amongst them as well. And being able to exemplify the messaging function also ensures to exemplify how big an impact Custodian users are making on Australia's climate change. Custodian faces risk within its initial rollout and future implementation. To minimize this risk, we have identified Tasmania as our test phase and initial rollout plan. This will ensure that the wider reach is kept at a minimal standard where we can control the testing phase and ensure that bugs and issues are resolved quickly as well. We've ensured that the future implementation of the app as well is done by a region basis rather than a national rollout. As you can see, we have identified 5 risks across different privacy concerns, the sustenance of long-term use, and data integrity as well. We wanted to ensure that we had addressed these issues by being able to place a good structured process within the app itself and establish a strong community amongst Custodian's users. use of geolocation and personal information to create an account and also to conduct certain functionalities, we had to consider ethical and privacy concerns within the design of the app. The first thing we did was to offer up a prompt box every time a user wants to enter data. This ensured them with the knowledge that they were consenting to sharing their data and having their data stored within the database to be used by the scientific community. The second consideration was the abuse of the system's rewards, and this was to enable a future implementation of a set limit of how many times or how many points a user can accrue according to their location or postcode. The third thing was also the data quality control, and by having structured data fields, it makes it easier for scientists to filter through good and bad data and harder for users to enter bad quality data.
Welcome to our team's presentation on Climate Collective, a Red Cross initiative to mobilise First Nations peoples as citizen scientists to collect valuable data and insights to champion the fight against climate change. The current problem landscape shows there's been over 50% loss in global biodiversity over the past 12 years to climate change. We conducted a root cause analysis on the problem being a lack of effective solutions for First Nations peoples to provide data on the experience of climate change. Thus, our problem statement is, there is a lack of knowledge being collected and shared about the Indigenous experience. This, paired with the rising social, cultural and ecological impacts of climate change, emphasises the need for an accessible digital solution to mobilise First Nations peoples as citizen scientists to empower their voices, preserve their traditional life and meaningfully address climate change.
The solution that we've built is a mobile application, and it's really looking at collecting and sharing knowledge between First Nations people on the issue of climate change. So it has 4 key areas: data collection, discovery and sharing, data analytics and security. So when a new user enters the application, they have to create an account through the Firebase authentication system. Next, they need to accept the terms and conditions. So this is really important for us for transparency on what data we're collecting, how we're using it, and what conduct we expect from them while they use the application. Next, they need to create their profile. So the big thing to talk about here is that we changed the scope of the nationality from just Indigenous Australian or non-Indigenous Australian to a more global I'm a First Nations person. This was implemented after feedback in our Week 7 MVP. Next, we have some how-to guidelines of how to use the app and what they can do. And then it comes to an acknowledgement screen. So this was really important to warn First Nations people that there may be images and names of deceased people in the application. And then it comes to the home screen. So in the top left, you can access your profile and get some basic analytics. You can sign out, and there's a help screen as well. One of the things that we were going to implement but didn't end up having time for was a chatbot. So this would be a good future improvement to let a user know how to use the application and how to run through the different screens. In terms of data collection, there's 2 ways that our application collects data. The first way is in the new entry. So this is the most important way for users to share their thoughts and feelings of the impact of climate change. So some things that it has is categorization of the specific subset climate change issue. It also allows for a support type to be selected. It also collects geolocation of where the user is submitting the data from. But if they're talking about something that's not actually in the location that they are from, then there's also a drop down for the kind of area or region that the entry refers to. They can also react to their own entry to let us know how they're feeling, and there's a helps page in the top right. We made sure that the data that we're collecting is really structured, so a lot of the input isn't free text, so that we can have clean and accurate data.
Climate Collective displays all user data entries with all important information. We wanted users to be able to express their emotions. Hence, users can react to these data entries based on their current thoughts and feelings of the data entry. Here, it will update this summarizing the 2 most used reactions for each data entry. One of the biggest feedbacks received from the teacher staff during the MVP presentation was, how do we know the data entries posted are factual? Well, this is where we added the validated entry badge that can be validated by scientist users within the app community, such as myself, by simply clicking the Validate Entry button. Also, upon receiving feedback testing from our BAs, they've suggested adding comments to foster better user interactions and engagement within the Climate Collective community. For example, I can enter in some text. Additionally, the initial vision for the Discover feed was to have a search filter sort filters based on location and categories. However, this was something we prioritized for future sprints. Instead, we prioritized security and privacy of the app, such as when capturing users' location, we only showed the state and country. Additionally, some challenges we faced was a trade-off between functionality and security, as videos are saved as a link in Firebase. This was a limitation, and instead we had to adapt by using explicit intent rather than embedded video. As mentioned briefly before, only scientist users can validate data entries. However, we also have two other users, citizen scientists and admin users. Citizen scientists are the general users where all users are given this role by default without any access to validating data entries. Originally, users can only be assigned as scientists in the backend. However, as part of the app enhancements, we decided it would be much easier to maintain and user-friendly to have a dedicated app screen where only admin users can see the user list button, so they can easily assign citizen scientist users with a scientist role to enhance content quality control.
Michelle Neal also talked about how important it is for citizen science apps to give feedback to the user on how their data is being used. So one of the things that we decided to implement was an analytics screen. So we have a few different charts here talking about like how people are feeling, what issues are the most important, and what support types are most needed to kind of battle climate change. There's lots of different opportunities for different charts for future improvements and really honing in on different kinds of demographics using the backend data. We also have the chart of the daily poll that is shown after you submit an entry.
During the earlier stages of the application, we knew we wanted to add a gamified feel to the application by rewarding users with coins for creating, reacting, and commenting to data entries. However, we didn't decide what exactly to use those coins for, but through feedback and research in the later sprints, we added a fundraiser screen with extensive validations and exception handling to ensure users can only donate the amount of coins they actually have to their chosen campaign without damaging the user experience.
The mission of Climate Collective is aiming to empower First Nations people to have a voice in the climate change discussion, monitor their feelings and thoughts on climate change, and allow them to provide traditional knowledge about their land, which may be an effective strategy mitigating climate change. It also facilitates interactions between First Nations people across the world that share similar experiences and makes a tangible impact on climate change through monetary donations. This is all with the aim to tackle UN Sustainable Development Goal 13, climate change, by contributing to Target 13.3 through improving the education and awareness raising on climate change by involving First Nations people into the discussion via our app.
We now come to the end of this demonstration. The summary of this demonstration is, climate change poses a major threat to the First Nations people, and it is important to include them in the climate smart initiatives. Bringing equity in innovations and technology while promoting citizen science programs for the First Nations people is feasible and should be focused on. The volunteering and partnerships will enhance social diversity, equity, and inclusion in decision making and promote social justice in emerging technologies, particularly in AI. The Red Cross Strategy 2030 and UN Sustainable Development Goals are good framework for sustainability in ESG. Our kite and wind turbine framework and model support AI governance and driving AI for ESG and sustainability projects, which is recommended to use. It was successfully tested in multiple social justice projects, reviewed by peers and leaders, and published in renowned conferences. Before closing the demonstration, I would like to invite our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership team to address the audience.
Thanks. As the slide says, I'm Jenny Brown. I head up the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander strategy and impact with what we call our Australian programs in Australian Red Cross. But my work and Lanisha's work is very much involved in our Red Cross Reconciliation Action Plan and ensuring that we're making the commitments that we said we were going to, and also in terms of walking alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So we do have a number of what we call place-based communities across Australia. We have 10 designated communities where we walk alongside, and then outside of that we have so many other communities that we walk alongside as well. And Lanisha's also in my team, so I will hand over to Lanisha.
Thanks, Jenny. So as you see, my name is Lanisha Johnson. And as Jenny mentioned, I am the Senior Project Officer within, the Aboriginal Strategy and Impact team. And I guess, I really support the work that we do with reconciliation as well as walking alongside our place-based sites. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I guess looking forward to answering some of the questions too. So thanks.
Thank you for participating in this demonstration. I'm Dr. Mahendra Samarvikrama from the Australian Red Cross.